Welcome to this BrightSign webinar. We've entitled it BrightSign 101, the idea being to address topics relating to bringing up a BrightSign player for the very first time. We intend this presentation for folks who have a new BrightSign player but have very little or no experience getting a player going, and our intention is to cover the very basics. Admittedly, there's a lot we could talk about. There are many advanced topics and capabilities. We're going to save those for a future webinar, and we'll be interested in your suggestions as to the topics we should cover. Please feel free to send an email to sales@brightsign.biz, and we'll make sure to add your suggestions to our list. But in the meantime, our topics are the following for today. Put yourself in the role of someone who just received a BrightSign player for the very first time, and the question is, now what? So in this webinar, we're going to cover the following 5 topics: player basics, just some very basic overview information about the different players we offer. We'll talk about installing the BrightAuthor application and configuring that application for first use. We'll talk about configuring a player for first use. Then we'll talk about putting together your first presentation and how to publish that first presentation out to BrightSign players. So those are our topics today. And we'll begin now with player basics. The BrightSign players consist of 3 models. Historically, we've shipped, up until about 3 months ago, we shipped players that were called the HD 1010, the HD 210, and the HD 110. Of course, I listed those in reverse order, the 110, 210, and 1010. And each player had a different set of I/O capabilities. These players have been updated, and starting about 3 months ago, we began shipping a new line, the Model 120, the HD 120, the Model HD 220, and the Model HD 1020. Now, an important thing to know is that these players are all equivalent in features. So, for example, where I used in the past the Model 110, I can now use the Model 120 with an identical feature set and identical capabilities. The same is true for the 210. It's been updated to the 220. And finally, the 1010 was updated to the 1020. We were careful to assure that these players were compatible with each other and compatible with BrightAuthor. So the result is you can build a network that is comprised of a mix of these players, both old and new, and you can publish the same presentation without any concern that a presentation, perhaps it was designed on the new player, will not run on the original player. It's simply not the case. Presentations designed for original players will run on the new player, and vice versa. Anything you build with the new player in mind can also run on one of the original players. Feature differences still apply. There are features in the 110 and the 120 in terms of I/O and capability that are unique to that model, just as there are feature differences between the 210, the 220, the 1010, and the 1020. So if you used features that depend on a model 1010 or 1020, of course, those features are not available in the other players, the 210 or the 220. So you have to pay attention, as you always did, to some of those differences, but you don't need to worry about growing a network that is a mix of old and new players, and so that's good news for everybody. The new model players are updated with new CPUs, a smaller footprint. They're physically smaller. They're the same height, but they're not quite as deep and they're not quite as wide, about an inch less wide and about an inch less deep. So you have a slightly smaller footprint. As you can see here in the drawing or in the picture, you'll note that the SD card slot and the status lights have moved around to the side of the new player, whereas in the original players, those were on the front. We wanted to get to a smaller player and to a lower cost, which we did, but we need to expose, of course, the same capabilities, and so the SD memory card slot simply moves around to the side, and the result is that the player is a little bit smaller. They're also less expensive. Where you did use the 1010 and now you can use a 1020, have the same capabilities at a lower price. Also, the new players are designed across a new chipset. The new media platform and the new CPU allow the player to perform more aggressively. It's faster with its updates. It's faster displaying images on the screen, particularly images like JPEG, where some decoding of the image is required, and decompression. JPEG images are highly compressed, and it requires a CPU to decompress that image. The new player is quicker at doing that type of thing than the old player was. So an image that might take an extra moment or two to be displayed by the Model 1010 is displayed virtually instantly by the Model 1020. So something to keep in mind: the smaller form factor, a faster CPU, and a lower cost. So all good advantages on the new line. And feature equivalent. The three models, the 120, 220, and 1020, line up very, very similar to the original 110, 210, and 1010. There is a key difference. I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. The Model 1020 is our highly interactive player. It also has a network interface. This is the player people use when you need to build an interactive presentation. And by interactive, we mean that the player expects to receive input from an external device, such as a touchscreen or a barcode reader or perhaps a keyboard and mouse. This player has the I/O essential to accomplish that. It has a serial port that allows it to talk to external devices via serial. That could be a display, or some other device. It has GPIO, which stands for General Purpose I/O. GPIO is the oldest method of interactivity. This is simple contact closure for detecting a button that's been pressed, or a switch has been closed, or a relay has been opened or shut. The player can detect those events and can act accordingly. The Model 1020, like the 1010, also has a USB port. And the USB port can be used either to attach memory. We have customers that have attached to large hard disks to the sides of their players because they need extra capacity. But the USB port can also be used to interact with a touch screen or a barcode reader. Probably the most common touch screen interface today is via USB. And so a player that's working in concert with a touch screen will have two connections. You'll connect HDMI video to the display so the player's video out can be shown, but you'll also run a USB cable between the display and the player. And this is how the display will report back to the player that it's been touched and where it's been touched, and the player can act accordingly. So the Model 1020, like the Model 1010, includes a USB port for that purpose. There's also a network interface on this model, so the player can be updated remotely. It can be managed over a network. A network connection also allows players to communicate with each other. So one player can send a message to another player, and the behaviors on one player can affect behaviors on another. This is a very useful feature and allows synchronized and highly coordinated presentations to be built. We see this all the time in museums and in amusement parks, where 10 or 15 or 20 players need to work together in concert and in tight coordination so that a complete user experience can be properly prepared and properly shown. Museums with 5 or 10 or 20 displays all working together to create an experience, either an art experience or historical experience. So the Model 1010 and the Model 1020 provide this I/O for interactivity. Moving up to the Model 220, or down in the product line, if you will, the Model 220 has none of the I/O that the Model 1010 and 1020 have. You'll see there's no serial port, there's no GPIO port, and there's no USB port. So there's no connectivity for serial devices, for buttons and contact closures, or for touch screens and barcode readers, or anything of that sort. The Model 220 does include a network interface, and therefore this player can be managed remotely, and in fact it can participate in coordinated presentations because the network connection is there. It allows the 220 to communicate with other players, and they can all work together to assure tight synchronization for a video wall or an amusement or museum presentation, but without GPIO, serial, or USB. This is a very popular player because it can be managed remotely. It can reside somewhere in the world and run very effective digital signage, a digital menu board, but generally in applications where no external I/O needs to take place. And then finally at the top here, you'll see our Model 1020. Now the Model 1020 does differ from the Model 1010 in one respect. The original Model 1010 was what we referred to as a simple looping player, a basic player. It had no I/O and it had no network interface. So you would insert a memory card with a presentation, and the player would simply run that presentation in a continuous loop virtually forever until you turn power off and perhaps replace the card with a new presentation. In the new Model 1020, we've included, and you can see it here on the front, we've included GPIO. So the Model 10, this Model 120 is capable of interfacing with external buttons and relays and contact closures. This is proving a very, very useful feature for presentations that need to run standalone, that are not going to be updated or managed over a network, but still add a measure of interactivity. A button press can trigger a different player behavior. So that's a difference in the Model 120 from the Model 110. The 110 did not have a GPIO port on the front. These are the basic players. You'll note that in the new line we don't include Wi-Fi versions. Those are coming when we finish the regulatory processes that are needed to ship a new Wi-Fi product. And so in the meantime, and until that's accomplished, we continue to make available the original Model 210W and the original Model 1010W. These players, at the same price as always, will give you the capabilities of a 210 or a 1010, but also include a Wi-Fi connection for those installation situations where a physical network connection would be difficult, but Wi-Fi meets the need. There's one more player you should be aware of. It's a newly announced player. The model AU320 was announced at Infocom last month in Las Vegas. This is an audio-only player. This player has no network, it has a network connection. It has no video output. The AU320 is intended to be used in situations where you need to provide ambient sound, voiceover, perhaps to a house audio system, or public announcements, but where there's no video component. Or perhaps to coordinate with other media players that have video out, but to provide an audio track or a carefully designed audio experience to run behind or around the other video players. It has a network interface and it has a serial interface to allow some interactivity with external devices. It has no GPIO and it has no USB, but in other respects behaves like a normal BrightSign player. It can be managed with BrightAuthor. It can live on the BrightSign network. It can be published to in the same fashion as the other players can be published to. And so in every respect, it is a BrightSign player, but without video output. There are multiple audio processors in this device, which allows us to do crossfades between audio streams. So you can have one audio file do a crossfade to another audio file, or you can blend a voiceover with background audio. And so the AU320 is a new BrightSign player and available to you in about 6 weeks. We expect availability on this player to begin in August of this year, August of 2012. So we're ready to begin our discussion of what do I do and what questions should I ask before I implement a BrightSign network system. Before you begin, you need to understand the answer to these questions. We'll need to talk about the type of memory card that your player will use. We don't include memory cards when we ship our players because there are just simply too many memory card options out there and different customers with different requirements. It would require us to stock just an incredible range of cards and to have those available. It simply works better for everybody to allow our customers to hop down to the nearest consumer electronics store and pick up the memory cards